So before we start, I would like to ask Professor Himla Soedel, the Executive Officer of ASSAf, to welcome all of you on behalf of the Academy. And then I'll hand over to Julian to say a few remarks about this webinar series, and then we will kick off the morning session. Thank you, Himla.
Thank you, Johan, and good morning, one and all, and a special warm welcome to all our panelists today. And yes, thank you, Johan, also for contextualizing the place of the Standing Committee within the family of the wider ASSAf family. Our standing committees are there to bring together, these expert thinking minds in a multidisciplinary way. And this standing committee, which is chaired by Julian May, addresses issues related to poverty and inequality, but in a multifaceted way. The bringing together issues related to food security, climate change, economics, and so on and so on. But I am particularly interested in this topic about how government funds, interventions, etc., and to what extent does this contribute to alleviating poverty and inequality. And I must say, I was quite amused when I heard the president announce a couple of days ago that members of parliament were struggling on their 1 million rand per annum allowances to survive. And yet we know how much of money is invested in other grants given to people on the grant system. So I think this is an ideal opportunity for us to understand the macro environment under which the government side of the thinking works, and also the extent to which you as experts in the field think about this. And I am looking forward to the deliberations going forward. So thank you, Johan, for facilitating, and thank you to Julian and members of the Standing Committee who are assisting us in bringing these sorts of topics to you. And welcome to our participants who have joined us, and we look forward to an engaging discussion. Thanks, Johan, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Himla. Thank you for those kind words. And I think you've also provided a nice context for us. Professor Julian May, Chair of our committee, over to you to give us some context in terms of the webinar series.
Thanks very much, Johan. So MIT economist Peter Timman published a book in 2019. The book's title was The Vanishing Middle Class, Power and Prejudice in a Dual Economy. He analyzes a number of large data sets to try and answer the question, how do people get out of poverty? The conclusion is rather sobering. He says that it takes 20 years of nothing going wrong. We've had something quite dramatic go wrong in the last decade. The inability of our economy to turn its economic growth into jobs. The inability of our economy to be able to reduce its poverty rates significantly, and finally the inability of our food system to feed our children adequately. And in 2020, things took a quite dramatic turn with the COVID pandemic and the introduction of the mitigation measures to deal with its transmission. If you look at Worldometer, which I do pretty much every morning, you'll see that we've done quite well in containing COVID, and also importantly in limiting the number of people who died from the disease. We've done this at a quite considerable cost, however, to our population. The NIDS-CRAM survey has shown an increase in hunger. Most other surveys are showing tremendous declines in household livelihoods. And shockingly, the Stats SA statistics released a few weeks ago pointed to the fact that our economy has managed to absorb 38.2% of the working age population in employment. Our subcommittee has been involved in debating these issues pretty much since the lockdown started. We have also met with colleagues working on the medical response to COVID and raised some of the concerns that we've had about the possible costs of the measures that have been undertaken, and have been involved in different capacities in asking how can we mitigate the spread of the disease without incurring such high costs. In September last year, we decided to ask 3 questions, believing that something now has got to give. If we don't do something quite dramatic, we really face a very worrisome future. So we've set in motion three webinars, 3 questions: what to do, how to pay for it, and would the state be capable of implementing what it is that we propose to do. 1 month ago, our colleagues in the Strategies for Poverty and Inequality Institute, under the and chaired by Isabel Fryer, conducted the webinar on what to do. Essentially, 2 quite bold strategies were spoken about. The notion of a universal grant. Decades ago, we talked about a basic income grant, and the notion of a very much enlarged public works program. The presenters spoke about the role that grants played during the COVID lockdowns in 2020, the reliance of households on those grants, and the impact, as far as they could tell, on when those grants were increased. They also spoke about the impact of the public works program from previous evaluation studies. I don't know what other people heard, but my own sense was there didn't seem to be much prospect of a dramatic public works program in actually resolving our problems in a cost-effective manner. So today, the panel have been asked the question, well, if that is the case, do you have other ideas? So the panelists are very welcome to say, well, you didn't think of increasing sin taxes. Perhaps that might solve the problem. And so we've asked them, in addition to that, if any reflections you might have on whether we're on the right track or not, whatever it is that we're going to do, it's going to take a lot of resources. How are we going to pay for it? So Johan, that's all I wanted to say on this, and I'll hand it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. That's a very nice context and summary of the discussion so far in this webinar series. So obviously, as you've said, our task here today is to talk about the funding options and how do we finance the programs to alleviate poverty. And obviously, it falls within the realm of macroeconomics, and by definition, the Bureau of Economic Research focuses on macroeconomics, and therefore it's very appropriate to have the Bureau facilitating this debate today together with the Academy and the subcommittee and the Standing Committee. So obviously we're dealing with fiscal and monetary policy and trying to figure out what are the sources of finance and funding available to deal with the poverty alleviation programs that could potentially be designed. Obviously, we're not debating the merit. I think that, Julian, you've helped us to understand the importance of taking action. The question is, how do we finance that? So we want to really debate that and to see how we fund those programs with merit and with those that could have substantive impact. And we've already spoken about the evaluation of public works programs and whether they had the necessary impact or not. So we are obviously in this context, as we debated today, aware of our fiscal crisis because of the years of poor policy choices, low growth, the recessions that we had, the COVID pandemic on top of that. But we're also aware that we have not paid attention enough over the years of investing in social infrastructure and in substantive poverty alleviation programs. And that we all know has been problematic for the last 25 years or so. And on top of that, we can add the decades of corruptions and state capture, where a lot of funds that should have been used for this important task have been lost to help us really improve the lives of the majority of our population. So we, as Julian rightly said, we are at the precipice. We need to do something. And the question is, how do we really do that? How do we fund this? How do we do this in a difficult scenario, actually? Because if you think of us debating the finance policies in almost a policy void, where Department of Social Development has not yet come up with a formal policy to deal with these important crises of poverty and inequality, it's probably very difficult to our colleagues in Treasury to think about the mechanisms to support the specific programs. So with that context, we basically are, in my mind, having to think about three questions. First of all, do we have the tax capacity left in the South African economy to extract enough revenue to make a difference? Secondly, does our government balance sheet allow us to borrow more on global capital markets, and what are the risks related to such a strategy? And thirdly, how do we deal with other critical priorities in our fiscal policy environment that also needs a set of funds and a set of finances in the midst of our fiscal crisis? So I'm very happy to have with us a team of panelists that agreed very kindly to help us debate this. It took a bit of convincing for everyone to participate, but I'm very glad they're all experts. So first of all, Judge Dennis Davis, you all know him very well. He will be providing some input at first, but also then moderate the discussion, because Dennis, you became a professional moderator and interviewer these days. I enjoyed your program on ENXA the other day when you interviewed Andre de Ruyter, and I hope you can in the same way extract information from our colleagues today about the real solutions for our fiscal situation. We all know Judge, he's a member of the Commission on Tax Structure in South Africa, and obviously a judge in the High Court. Then Dr. Gilad Isaacs, Director of the Institute of Economic Justice. They've been very vocal about the Universal Basic Income Grant and other forms of social relief that we need to introduce, and they've also ventured into potential sources of financing these programs. So Gilad, we would like to hear your views on the financing options as part of your introductory remarks. Then also Professor Stan du Plessis, a professor in macroeconomics at Stellenbosch University, also chair of our governance board at the Bureau of Economic Research, and also a very important role in the university as the chief operating officer. So he almost practiced fiscal policy in the university as well. Then Professor Ingrid Woolard, the Dean of the Faculty of Economic Management Sciences, my real boss. Welcome, Ingrid. Thank you for participating in this webinar. We look forward to your presentation. Then Mr. Edgar Sishi, the Head of Budget Office in National Treasury. Thank you, Edgar, for participating. I know you're probably having the most difficult task in South Africa of trying to meet the needs and of all demanding fiscal resources. So we would like to hear your views as well as you debate this process. And then lastly, but not least, Mamoketa Lijana from ABSA, also macroeconomist by training, but now in ABSA Capital, trading in various elements of capital and finance. So thank you very much for all of you for agreeing. Judge Davis, I think it's now over to you. You can provide us a few introductory remarks from your perspective on the Tax Commission, and then you can run the program with the panelists, where they will each have 5 to 10 minutes to provide initial input, and then you can debate with them various elements of their input as you go on. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Professor Kirsten. Thank you for inviting me. And I think I'll make some very brief remarks, and then from Gilad Isaacs I'm not going to jump up and down, so each one can make their opening remarks thereafter, and then we'll have the panel as you suggest. Let me just say, by way of introduction, I was intrigued by the three questions that Professor May outlined in terms of your inquiry: what to do, how to pay, and is the state capable of dealing with them? They're so inextricably linked that it's hard to divide the one from the other. And it's particularly hard to divide the one from the other because perhaps the overarching question that we have to ask ourselves is the following: how is it that we can deal with prevailing levels of inequality and poverty, which have got worse over the past 25 years, not better? And it's not just about COVID. It's a long and slow march into a greater heart of darkness each and every year, save for a couple of years when there might have been a commodity boom and perhaps a corner greengrocer would have been able to run the economy relatively successfully. But once the challenges which we encountered took place right across the world, we really haven't done very well. And I suppose the first question one would always ask oneself is, well, how does one fund any kind of program which deals with inequality and poverty? The answer is, well, if you could grow at perhaps 4 or 5% a year, the problem would resolve itself. And so, in a way, the big elephant in the room, if I could put it that way, is the almost extraordinary inability which we have to find ourselves a trajectory which will achieve those kind of growth targets. And we are talking this morning in the context of an electricity crisis, which is, if you listen to my interview with Mr. De Ruyter, who I wish to add in parentheses, I found extremely impressive and very thoughtful, one would have realized that if Mr. De Ruyter basically was left alone in circumstances where the government simply supported him, we actually could get out of this crisis in a relatively short period of time. In other words, it was abundantly clear to me that we have already the ability to generate between 2,000 to 5,000 megawatts within the next 12 months if you allowed the renewable sector to actually do what it should be doing, let alone being able to raise additional capital, because the world is so concerned about the environmental damage caused by a carbon-intensive economy that it's possible to raise funding for this, which, by the way, is not totally irrelevant to our discussion, and that's why I'm mentioning it, because it would give us a significant injection of capital for turbocharging the renewable sector, creating further jobs, and in fact releasing the kind of growth that we require in this economy to ultimately deal with the fundamental issues of the problem. And the fact that we can't do that, the fact that Mr. De Ruyter can't do that, because frankly, the ministry of responsible seems to be have a different view. And the fact that we may burden ourselves with another quarter of a trillion rand with power ships, whatever it is just increasingly disturbing. And I wanted to make those remarks because I think we need to keep our eye on the ball. And certainly we need, in a sense, to be shouting as loud as possible as to why it is that the obvious solutions to the particular problem are the ones which we are failing to implement. Now, given the fact that I have absolutely no confidence that over the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to grow at more than 2.5% a year. And by the way, my lack of confidence is supported by all the figures beyond this year, because nobody's telling me that we're going to do more than, say, 3, if we're lucky. Then the question arises, well, where do you find the money for what you've been talking about, Professor Kirsten and Professor May? That is, how do you fund, whether it be a basic income grant, which of course is more than worthy of careful consideration and implementation, and a range of other programs, whether they be public works, or alternatively, perhaps even more important than that, a kind of reversal of what seems to me to have been a kind of austerity program announced in the last budget, of a kind that certainly will never get us to the growth rates that we require, which is a catch-22 situation. And of course, there are only if you're going to assume constant growth, then clearly the natural course of tax collection increases are not available to you. So then the question arises, well, how do you get more money in circumstances where quite clearly that is what's required? And then there are only two solutions. One is tax increases, and the other is more efficient tax collection. So let me put my cards on the table. I remain unconvinced that any significant tax increases, in other words, increases in the nominal rate, are going to get you the sort of money which is required in order to generate the finance for programs such as an overall basic income grant, a reversal of the general austerity in circumstances where greater forms of capital infrastructure can be implemented in terms of programs, or a public works program, or any other similar form of program that in the shorter to medium run would alleviate the problems we have. Why do I say that? Because you can run the numbers. You can run the numbers on a personal income tax. You can run the numbers on corporate tax. And then, of course, you get to the vexed problem of the wealth tax, which I'm not against, and I've always said that. The question which I think Professor Woolard and I, in a report that we did, raised as well, there's a whole range of issues that you have to put in place in order to implement a wealth tax, and then the comparative evidence does not indicate a significant sums of money, of the kind of money that some people claim. And what I'm therefore saying is that I think there are very limited possibilities of tax increases, providing the largesse, if I could use the wrong word, I suppose, in order to fund the programs and therefore pay for the alleviation of poverty and the more fundamental question at the same time of the redress of inequality. And of course, the second issue then becomes the central point of focus, which is tax collection. Now, there are at least two or three issues here. The one that you've already mentioned is the egregious levels of corruption and the loss and hemorrhaging of state finances. Mr. Holden, in his evidence before the Zondo Commission, spoke about 50 billion that had been secreted out by the Guptas. But of course, he said that was only a partial picture, and he's right. Indications are that those figures are probably much more than 100 billion. And that's just the Guptas. That's not the rest of the stuff that has gone on. So we've got extraordinary levels of basically plundering of state resources. And if you just focus attention even on the 50 billion, I mean, just think about that 50 billion is probably around about 4 cents in every rand of tax collected in a year, let's say, would go to the Guptas. Well, you're not ever going to get out of the problem if that's the case, because you may redistribute money to Dubai, but you're certainly not going to ensure that you are going to have that money available to those most in need. It is truly the scandal of our times that the vast majority of our population have been utterly impoverished by this constant plundering of state resources, which continues today, and it's not just the Guptas, as much as I would hope that they could be brought back to South Africa and stand trial. So the first issue is, how on earth are we going to actually ensure that every rand we collect is actually spent in its designated portfolios for the proper purposes? The second is, there's no question that there are significant gaps between the nominal rate of tax and the effective rate of tax. And those numbers are far greater than any tax increase can realistically bring in money. I say that because it has become obvious, certainly in the work that we've done in the Davis Tax Committee and work that I've been doing subsequently in consulting for SARS, that we are talking about very significant monies which are not collected. I'm not only talking about high net worth individuals, where manifestly there's significant sums of money that are not paid to the fiscus, both in terms of simple tax evasion in South Africa, cruder forms, forms of tax evasion, which clearly are accompanied by the corruption to which I've already made reference, and also, of course, just the amount of money that's been secreted overseas to various offshore bank accounts, trusts and companies, which do not therefore fall within our net for the obvious reason. I also refer to egregious practices of transfer pricing, most of which I would suspect comes from middle type of sized companies, not so much the big ones, not to suggest that they aren't also guilty, but often if you have to comply with regulatory authorities, it's less likely than it is with those who fly below the radar, but there you are. Often those transfer pricing is accompanied by very significant abuses of the customs system. They're often coupled at the tote. That is, you bring in goods and you underprice them in circumstances where you pay no customs duty. You therefore can destroy local industries at the same time, because basically they avoid any tariffs and taxes that are imposed. And then you get the money out, the profits out, by various intricate forms and not so intricate forms of transfer pricing. That's clearly. We've also discovered incredible erosions, and I use the word incredible because I was quite incredulous when I heard about them, forms of VAT fraud. There's a second-hand gold fraud scheme, which really has cost us billions, and which, thank goodness, to some extent, we have been able to get on top of, but not entirely. So what I'm really saying, in summary, is if you really want to know where there is significant additional money, there is significant additional money in an increase in the tax collection system. That, of course, in turn will require, and that's what SARS are trying to do at the moment, greater audit capacity, a question of data scientists who can assist in this particular regard, and in a sense, supporting the trajectory which the present commissioner has very commendably set course for SARS, and there's no doubt there's been a significant turnaround in SARS as an institution from the moment that Kisveta took over from Moyani. So I would say that is a significant challenge, and that is where vast majority of money is going to come, if you're going to ask me. But overarching that, and I'll finish with this, is we really need to think through how are we going to, as it were, generate a pattern of growth which will allow for greater sums of money to be collected, notwithstanding that you never get 100% of that which you budget for, simply because there will always be some form of tax evasion. And I would be very interested, I'm going to be very interested in whether, what proposals the panelists come up with, both in relation to whether, in fact, tax increases can take place. One other thing I would say, two things I would say, is there are ways in which we can reconfigure the tax system. I'm not sure that decreasing the corporate rate of tax as promised in the budget from 28% to 27%, particularly bright idea, but I'd be interested in what panelists have to say. And the second is, I do think we should be reconfiguring tax incentives to ensure that they support employment through business. That is, that there is some incentive for increasing the labor content, particularly in the light of the threats of the fourth industrial revolution, which raises a whole range of other questions, which I can't go into. But I will leave it as that for my introductory remarks. And thank you very much again for organizing this particular panel. So I don't know whether you want me now to call on the panelists, Professor.
Yes, I think it's probably the best now that they
Okay, in which case I think the first one up is Dr. Isaacs. Gilad Isaacs, who we've already introduced. And Gilad, over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Dennis. And thanks to the organizers for the invitation. I think this is a really important topic and a fantastic lineup of speakers here. Just to, as a sort of a few opening comments before diving into some of the technical aspects. The first is to appreciate that public finances is complicated. I think that too often in these conversations, there's an adoption of people's corners and a non-recognition of the fact that there's a series of of complex trade-offs here. And in an opening 5 minutes, you sometimes will miss that. In particular, I think there's two key dangers. The first, when it comes to revenue, is that you can increase tax or increase debt service costs to such an extent that it reduces economic activity, or it crowds out other social expenditure. At the same time, you can spend too little and collect too little, undermine economic growth, destroy long-term physical and human capital, generate social unrest, and reduce the ability to raise revenue in the future. Now, this is the austerity road, which Judge Davis has already mentioned. Now, unfortunately, the public conversation and from parts of the state emphasize the first risk, which in certain circumstances is a real one, and underplay the second risk. And in public finances, I think we are trying to mediate the line in between these two risks to attempt to achieve the kind of growth path which Judge Davis has mentioned. In a demand and supply constrained economy, we have a real risk with our current public finance approach of entering into that second danger. The appropriate starting point, therefore, is, I think, to work out what are the needs which we have, and then to try and explore what the financing options are, rather than to start with some notion of what the finite envelope might be. In the planning of this, there was talk of both tax and of debt and government's balance sheets. And I'm going to just say 2 or 3 minutes on each of those as a opening. The first is on debt. The key issue here is on debt service costs, not on the absolute level of debt, for which there is no kind of magic number above which this is harmful. We've spoken actually at an URSA webinar on risks of crowding out, of solvency, of liquidity, none of which I argued there pose a significant threat. But there's no doubt that there's a potential for the increase in the share of public funds spent on debt service costs, which can undermine other social expenditure. To my mind, this requires a more interventionist monetary policy stance, and in 3 main ways. The first is more aggressive quantitative easing, like action by the Reserve Bank to serve as a purchaser of government bonds in an aim to reduce borrowing costs. The second is increased capital management techniques like targeted capital controls, which reduce forms of speculative activity and make it easier to manage borrowing costs. The third is the subsidized credit extension by the Reserve Bank to entities like the IDC, infrastructure projects, the South African Development Bank, that by extending a targeted range of subsidized credit, you can remove burdens off the fiscus and allow for a expansion of certain projects. So that's, I think, some of the key ways of thinking about the challenges in debt. In taxation, and I agree with Dennis's points, which he has raised about tax collection. I think there is no doubt that in those areas, there are room for significant improvements. I have been asked to speak to some of the tax increases, which we've explored, which I'll show, which I do think, whilst not solving the overall tax problem, do offer avenues for increased revenue. Before that, though, 6 principles. The first, and I'll be blunt here, is that it's absolute madness to speak about a reduction in corporate income tax in this current global context, which is speaking about increasing that globally. In fact, an EU study showed that the proposed new global minimum tax rate can raise about 50 billion rand annually for South Africa. The second principle is that we must tax wealth and income from wealth more because we, comparative to the OECD and other benchmarks, undertax this area. The third is that we've explored specific taxation for the social security measures we believe are needed. The fourth is to remove tax breaks for the wealthiest and ineffective tax breaks for corporations. The fifth is to tax undeserved or harmful behavior. And the sixth, which has been mentioned, is the significant energy into fixing tax administration. Towards the implementation of a BIG, we then explored where might there be avenues for increased revenue. And what I'm showing you now draws from an updated work which we've done with DNA economics and shows some of the tax options. We can revisit this because I'm running out of my time, but essentially we look at a sliding scale of social security payroll tax like a UIF. If a BIG is implemented, it's important to note that all of those earning below 350,000 still come out with a increased income every year. And that tax, offers a quite significant potential. A resource rent tax, it taxes undeserved
Gillard, are you there? You've broken up.
Yeah. I was worried as myself, but it's obviously, oh dear.
I think you had some internet.
I don't know if you've, We could move on.
Yes.
And come back to Gillard. I'm in your hands here.
Yes, I think, Dennis, let's move on to Stan. I think.
Professor, it's Professor Du Plessis, I think, is the next person up. We'll come back to after. Hopefully, we can reconnect with Dr. Isaacs. Carry on, Professor.
I hope so too. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And Johan, in your introduction, you summarized my macroeconomic perspective, at least in anticipation, very well. You mentioned the third question was, what should we do about other priorities on the national budget? And And it is an important question because of your first two questions, which is, do we have the tax capacity or can we borrow more? And with those two questions, you reminded us that government too has a budget constraint. It is not an annual cash constraint, it is an intertemporal constraint, but ultimately we as a society need to mobilize the resources that we collectively wish to spend on our collective priorities on the national budget. And in the South African case, that has now become a binding discussion because of the cumulative impact of 10 years of fiscal deterioration. So if we had this discussion 10 years ago, we would have had a discussion about much more room potentially on the national budget to pursue these kinds of initiatives. As it stands, we don't. I agree with Gillard that the question is not one of what level of debt to GDP we should aim for. That is not a helpful number to understand the fiscal constraint. What is a helpful number is to look at the burden of the interest bill on the national budget. And to look at that, I'm going to share my screen with you and show you the result of some modeling that I've been doing for the last 10 years. So I've used a structural model to model the evolution of our debt and interest burden over the course of the last 10 years, starting in 2011. This is a structural macroeconomic model that takes into account the structural shocks, both on the real economy and on fiscal policy. And it has been highly accurate over the course of the last 10 years or so. And what you see on the screen in front of you is the projection for the interest to GDP ratio. That's the public interest bill relative to the tax base for the next 2 years. We're currently at a bit more than 5%, and you will recall from the national budget that the minister foresaw that we were going to have an interest bill in this understanding, in the number that I'm showing you now, of about 5.3% in the medium term. That, I think, was a fairly optimistic expectation by the minister, and it's based on the assumption that we get a grip on the fiscal deterioration instantly. Nothing in the last 10 years suggests that we will get a grip on this problem instantly. It is, in fact, a very deep and difficult problem to solve on the fiscal side. The projection that you see is 100 simulations of our fiscal reality in South Africa, and it is not a worst case. It is in many ways a best case simulation, because I drew potential growth and I drew the primary surplus of government from the distribution of the entire last 20 years. And as you know, especially on the fiscal side, but also on the growth side, the last 10 years, if I used just that distribution, would have given me a far less optimistic picture projected into the future. But what you see on the screen in red is the median of 100 projections for our interest burden over the next 2 years. The upper dotted line is the 75th percentile of the distribution, and the lower dotted line is the 25th percentile of this distribution. So 50%, well, I'll put it differently, 75% lies above the lower dotted line, but at least in half of the cases, we can expect to have to deal with an interest burden of almost 8% in 2 years' time, 8% of GDP. There is almost no country in the world that can or has managed to sustainably pay 8% of GDP just on the interest bill on public debt. So we really are heading towards a binding fiscal constraint. We cannot spend more than a quarter of our public resources servicing the debt stock. And that means that we have to come to grips. And that is unfortunately now, and it is the cumulative result of many years of fiscal deterioration. We now have to deal with this problem, even though it is absolutely true that we have all of these important social problems to deal with as well. So what can we do? Our current tax base is already, in terms of structure, a developed tax base, and I don't think there is much gain to be made from the structure of our tax base, nor from the level of particular taxes. There is some minor variation that you can get there. I'm not saying it is absolutely fixed, but if you look in comparison with upper middle income countries, we have already a developed tax structure, both in terms of tax base, both in terms of structure and level. There is indeed scope on the efficiency of tax collection. So that would be one way of trying to improve the fiscal situation. There is no hope that the multiplier impact of a large expenditure program such as a universal basic income will somehow generate the growth which Judge Davis spoke about that would solve this problem on its own accord. All the empirical estimates of expenditure multipliers on the fiscal side tell us that that is not a realistic expectation to have. Those multipliers are not just a bit too small, they are vastly too small to give us any hope in that direction. So if it's not the multiplier, if it's not higher taxes, it leaves us the discussion on monetary policy, and I'm not persuaded that there is any possibility for us to solve the debt problem through monetary policy. The powerful balance sheet of the bank is an appropriate tool to assist when our financial sector faces difficulties. The idea that the central bank can simply create rand balances to solve a fiscal problem is one that has been tried many times over in the course of the last century, in the sort of era of central banking, and the results are predictable, that you destabilize your currency, you destabilize either in the form of domestic inflation or in the form of a currency depreciation, both of which lead to higher local interest rates and ultimately an unsustainable fiscal position. So the answer in the end, Johan, is that we have to deal with your third question. If the universal basic income is indeed going to be prioritized above other national priorities, then the hard question is, how will we cut back other expenditure on the national budget as well as consolidate the fiscal position, both of which will make this a particularly difficult program to embark on now. And I'm going to stop there and hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Professor. I wonder if we could go back to Dr. Isaacs. Gilad, if you take 3 or 4 final minutes to complete your thing. I'm sorry we lost you, but please carry on. I think you were telling us you were on your slide of a series of tax proposals that you were putting up. So if you want to continue there, continue with pleasure.
Excellent. Thanks very much. I'm assuming that slide is up on the screen again.
It is, yes.
Okay, great. So I was going through some of these options which we had identified. I think I was on a resource rent tax, which taxes excess profits during commodity booms. We then look at a selective removal of tax benefits to the wealthiest on pension funds and medical aids, which combined raise just under 40 billion. Increase in a dividend tax, which can raise an extra 10 billion. We then go on to look at consumption taxes and wealth taxes, including some income from wealth. So the implementation of a premium VAT rate on a basket of luxury goods, the minimal increase in a carbon tax to combined raise about 10 billion. The net wealth tax conversation is a lengthy one, and I won't go into it now. This figure draws from the paper by the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, but we appreciate that it's a complex and a uncertain outcome there. A currency transaction tax, which taxes rand trading, a increase in estate duty, and a minor increase in the security transfer tax, all of which raise relatively small amounts, but which would also move us to more in line with middle income and OECD norms in terms of taxing these areas. Finally, coming to some of those kind of easiest baseline issues in a reduction in corporate tax breaks, particularly the ineffective employment tax incentive, and then just a limited reduction of wasteful and irregular expenditure. So that raises almost 200 billion. Not necessarily all of these are implementable simultaneously. We also look with a basic income at the share of expenditure on vatable items, which would also then return a share of that. I do have a slide here on the costs of a basic income grant, which if we need to, we can revisit. I'm going to stop there, but Judge Davis, I'm assuming there'll be opportunities afterwards, because I take issue both on the analysis of multipliers and monetary policy, which we've just heard.
Well, the whole idea is to debate that, so you don't have to take issue with that now.
Yes, so I'm going to leave that.
I'll take issue with that later. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Ingrid Willard.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for the invitation.
You can take issue with anybody you like.
So I really want to thank Gilad for putting something concrete on the table. I think it's really hard to talk about tax proposals in the abstract. And so I'm going to respond to some of what Gilad said. I hope Gilad doesn't interpret that as me taking issue with him in any way. I think it helps to unpack these ideas. So I'm going to share my screen, I hope. I will try, and put up what, just give me 1 second. I'm not good at talking and pressing buttons, turns out. I think, good. I think you can now see what you should see. I'm just going to change the display settings so that I'm in. Can you just see my presentation, Dennis?
Yes, I can. Please carry on.
Thank you so much. So let me just make one quick point before I talk about the tax proposals. And that's just to say that I think we need to be very cognizant of the fact that policies aimed at poverty alleviation aren't just about cash transfers. So I don't want to be misunderstood on this point. I'm a great proponent of cash transfers. I think many of the people in the room know that I've done a lot of work on cash transfers. I think they're incredibly effective. I think they're an essential part of government policy. But they're not the only part of government policy. And so while cash transfers are essential for short-term poverty relief, they're essential for breaking the intergenerational transmission of poverty, we do also need a capable and functioning state. And so I worry a little bit that sometimes we fixate on talking about, well, we need more cash transfers. And we're not also having the conversation about how do we raise enough revenue for a functioning educational system, for rolling out national health insurance, or ensuring that there's good infrastructure. And so Dennis, I think you touched on that issue at the start, but I did want to reiterate it. So I think the fact that we have a state that's really good at administering grants, we do that in a way that is reasonably cheap. It's incredibly effective, but it's one component of a pro-poor government strategy. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about some of the proposals that Gilad put up. I'm speaking to an older version of the work that he and his colleagues have done at the Institute for Economic Justice. So apologies if I'm a little bit off in terms of the numbers, but I think the basic principles are there. So I think there are quite a few things that Gilad and I would agree on. In the earlier version, he talks about replacing estate duty with progressive income tax, progressive inheritance tax. I think that's a great proposal. So I'm interested in the fact that in this morning's presentation, that seemed to have disappeared from the current set of proposals. So Dennis, I'm hoping we can come back to that in the discussion.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about increasing the carbon tax. I think it's a bit of a non-starter in terms of being a form of tax revenue that we could use for pro-poor policies. I think even though I don't believe in earmark taxes, I do think that the carbon tax is one example where there is probably an argument to be made for saying that carbon taxes need to be spent on environment. But one way or another, it's not a lot of money. Then Gilad spoke about the fact that the employment tax incentive is completely ineffective and should be scrapped. I think there are different perspectives on that, but I think that's perhaps a discussion for a different day. I think there certainly are some people who believe that the employment tax incentive is an important part of ensuring that we get more young people into work. But perhaps Gilad has other ideas about how we could do that. Some completely uncontroversial points about how we should make government more efficient and more effective, reducing cabinet size, reducing departmental duplication. Absolutely, nobody would disagree with that. Item 10 there, the clawback on irregular or wasteful expenditure. Absolutely, nobody would disagree that if we can reduce corruption, if we can reduce fruitless expenditure, then that ought to happen. Of course, the difficulty is how do we do that? And so it feels a little bit glib to say, okay, we're going to get this money back and then we're going to use it in this particular way. I think it's something that needs to happen regardless of what we then choose to spend the money on, but it's not straightforward. Gilad spoke about base erosion and profit shifting. Absolutely. I think there's good work that's currently on the table. Dennis and some of our colleagues in the Davis Tax Committee have just put together a new report on BEPS. I think we're some years away from making it a reality, but there's certainly progress on that front. The luxury VAT is something that Gilad and I have disagreed on in the past. Again, perhaps it's something we can come back to in the discussion. I think it's really hard to identify items on which that we can clearly specify as being luxury items. The difficulty in the VAT system always comes in when you have different tariffs. You need to be sure that you can easily identify whether an item is a luxury item or a non-luxury item. And I think there are very few examples of items that are so obviously luxury items. We typically in the literature talk about yachts. Sure, we can all agree that a yacht is a luxury item, but luxury motor vehicles. But beyond that, it actually becomes quite difficult. So when we start to talk about our smartphones luxury items, maybe they are, maybe they're not. But yeah, I am dubious of whether or not there's 11 billion in a luxury VAT. I'll come back to the wealth tax. I think we need to talk about that a little bit more. Okay, but the real, a big chunk of the money in Gilad's proposals are coming from this new social security tax, from eliminating medical tax credits on those that are earning above a threshold, and by eliminating retirement fund contributions, deductions for those earning above a threshold. I have great difficulty with tax proposals that start, or tax amendments that start at a particular threshold. I think it's just infeasible to introduce these sorts of discontinuities in the tax system. I don't think you can suddenly say, okay, the moment you earn R1 more, you're in a completely different tax regime. I struggle with the idea of eliminating the medical tax credits just for some people. I think either we believe the medical tax credits are a critical part of the current healthcare financing system, or we think that they should be scrapped. And the work that we did in the Davis Tax Committee on National Health Insurance suggested that at the time that NHI is rolled out, it would be entirely appropriate to scrap medical tax credits. At the point that NHI is functioning, then we want as many people as possible to come into the NHI net, and it would be feasible to do away with medical tax credits. I think that's probably the only opportunity one has to do that. I think it's a discussion. I think the medical tax credits are again an example of a tax that I would want to ring fence as being available for NHI, but not for other purposes. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the retirement fund contribution deduction. So the proposal from the Institute for Economic Justice is that if you earn more than $1 million, you shouldn't be able to deduct your retirement contributions. So I have 3 concerns about that. The first is that this effectively means that there's this very, very sharp discontinuity at R1 million. So if you earn R1 less than R1 million, you get this massive tax benefit of being able to deduct all your retirement contributions. So currently, I don't want to get too technical, but currently you can deduct up to 350,000 Rand a year in retirement contributions. If you're earning R1 million a year, your marginal tax rate is 41%. So essentially what we would be saying here is the moment you earn R1 more, your tax liability is going to increase by 140,000 Rand. And you just can't have those sorts of discontinuities in the system. So I accept that Gilad will probably come back and say, all right, fine, well, we could phase it in, we can do it a little bit differently. But let's just look at what this would actually mean for a taxpayer, because I think it's important that we talk about concrete proposals, but then it's also important that we think about what those would actually mean for a person. And I take cognizance of the fact that, in the introduction, a mention was made of the president talking recently about parliamentarians who perhaps are struggling to live on R1 million a year. I absolutely agree that if you're earning R1 million a year, you are well paid. Absolutely, you are well paid. So let's think about that person. Let's call him Professor Jones. He's an associate professor at any South African university. Actually, I don't know why I said he. Let's say Professor Jones is a woman. She's an associate professor at any South African university. She's earning 1.1 million a year. That's the median salary of an associate professor in South Africa. I suspect many of our participants in this webinar are in this sort of salary bracket. Absolutely well paid by South African standards, without a shadow of doubt. So if we were to impose these 3 new taxes, the social security tax, which for all intents and purposes is really just more personal income tax. It isn't actually a different tax. And we take away the medical tax credits and we impose this, and we take away the retirement contribution change. Our Professor Jones, for argument's sake, she's got 3 dependents. She pays medical aid of 8,000 Rand a month, so a middle of the road medical aid scheme. Under those 3 taxes, her take-home pay would go from 45,000 Rand a month, which is a very reasonable amount of money, down to 34,000 Rand a month. That's not a small change in her tax liability. It's a massive change in her tax liability. So I think we need to be careful when we talk about all these incremental taxes. It doesn't look unreasonable when you see it on the schedule that Gilad put up. It's a little bit here, it's a little bit there. But for the taxpayers that are being targeted under the scheme, these are not small tax changes. And that just makes me question how feasible it really would be to impose those taxes all at the same time. So I guess my plea here is just that we accept that this is not easy. We need to be pragmatic about it. I know I'm out of time, so I'm going to say one last very quick thing about the wealth tax. As Dennis mentioned earlier, he and I have worked on a wealth tax. We're strong proponents of a wealth tax, but we don't think that there are vast amounts of revenue to be raised through the wealth tax. We think it's an important component of protecting the integrity of the overall tax system. We think by having SARS collect good information on assets in addition to income, they would do a better job in collecting income taxes. And we also believe that wealth is a separate tax base that is worthy of taxation. But it's extremely difficult to design a new wealth tax. And I mentioned here a couple of the reasons why that's hard to do. In the discussions that we had, the public consultations we had over the wealth tax, lots of lobby groups coming in saying, oh, but surely we should exempt pension funds. Surely we should, what about your primary house is surely not something that would be in the net. Very, very quickly, there's slippage in the discussion and people start to talk about exemptions. It would be really important to include taxpayers' offshore wealth. That means much more data collection would need to happen. We certainly think that that's important, but it's not necessarily straightforward. So let me leave it there and just say that in terms of a design for a wealth tax, there's a lot of work that needs to happen. I think we're a few years away from any of this coming to fruition. And so we then make some suggestions in the work that Dennis and I have done about, well, what could we do in the meantime? And one of those things we suggest is that at least put the building blocks in place to start designing a wealth tax. And at the same time, that would increase, we believe, that would increase revenue collections on the income tax side by ensuring that there's better reporting, both from the individual and by third-party organizations. We think that we will, through those mechanisms, start to collect more income tax because there'll be greater integrity in the system. And then finally, which I'm hoping Dennis will talk a little bit about, is that we need to do more auditing of those people that have been named in the Panama and Paradise Papers, for example, or have been fingered in corruption allegations, for example, in the Zondo Commission. So thank you, Dennis. I'll leave it there.
Dennis, you're on mute.
My dog was barking, which is why I put myself on mute. Doesn't seem to appreciate Ingrid as much as I did. Sorry, Edgar, you are the next one up. If you could make your presentation, be very grateful.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Judge. I'm going to...
I call you Edgar, you can call me Dennis.
Very well. So I think, mine is, let me just indicate that obviously in South Africa, we have a policy lead department in government on this issue. So I am going to resist the temptation to make recommendations that put me in their place. So my position as a government official does make it a little bit awkward for me here, but that's fine. I will, as the minister likes to say, stay in my lane in my contribution. I think the first observation I just want to make is, we just share a screen here, is that, the webinar is called How to Fund Interventions That Reduce Poverty in South Africa, and that's fine, and I think it's a very useful discussion. I do think that in general, when we consider things over the long term, and one could, you could have a webinar, you could rename it How to Reduce Poverty in South Africa, period. The reason I say that is that I do think that it's clear that over the years we have very significant structural problems, including in respect of our labor market, that have a greater upstream impact on levels of poverty and inequality. And I think that often that doesn't get discussed very much, and the focus is solely on redistributive measures through fiscal policy. I say that not because I don't believe that fiscal policy has a role to play, it does, but I do think that the focus on fiscal policy does have an insidious effect in including in the conversation, both in the body politic, but also in the general population, because my interactions with, whether it's in cabinet or parliament, is that people have a sense that there is a unicorn there. So I think that, and the unicorn is called fiscal policy, and it can solve all things. And I think that the lack of a discussion about what actually does reduce poverty in an economy is for me, a challenge, even at a time when we had strong economic growth. Of course, it was interrupted by the GFC, but we were only able to achieve 22% unemployment rate. I think we need to ask ourselves very significant questions in that regard. let me just see here. And, you know, this growth problem, this problem of South Africa's economic performance is a long-running problem, such that even when we're doing well, we are a perennial underachiever. And this has significant implications for what we can do with respect to poverty. And in my view, this has played a big role in, not talking about this, excuse me, has played a big role in what I consider to be a greater focus on fiscal policy than we perhaps need. I mean, Edward Kiswitter often says, and he has said it in Parliament, that he thinks that if we were to solve all the problems with tax administration, we could get, you know, he thinks that we can get an additional 100 billion rands in tax revenue a year. 100 billion rands is a lot of money, but we have a fiscal gap that's 5 times that big. So while it's true that the issue is not about the overall size of debt, and I agree with Gillett in this respect, and I made the same point when I presented on the DA's fiscal responsibility bill, that it's not about the overall size of the debt. The implications of the debt overhangs are quite significant, not just for the fiscus, but also for the overall economy. But I think that to the extent that we don't address this perennial our inability to achieve decent levels of growth, we're gonna continue to struggle, and I don't see how the fiscus carries or substitutes for that problem. Similarly, with respect to our credit risk as a country, we have observed that we are starting to see a significant level of differentiation in the market, where it's clear that we cannot, because of this, there's a decoupling that's happened. And the market, I think, has grown wary of South Africa's persistent economic underperformance. So the idea that there are opportunities to finance new expenditure needs to be really, it needs to be approached with a pinch of salt, because we're seeing something quite different in the market. I think this also is what is affecting, and appropriately so, the thinking at the Reserve Bank, because South Africa has a very, very significant risk of debasing its currency. I think, you know, if we look at what happened in Argentina, and we think about the overall, if we take the emerging market average and we kind of use that as a base, we've always expected that we could mirror the EM trends. But recently, last year, obviously, we started seeing a big change and a big spike that was bigger than what we saw in the global financial crisis. Obviously, the reason, the crisis originated elsewhere, and we had our financial sector was a lot stronger. But the point is that we are concerned that the assumptions that are being made around our ability to finance persistent deficits no longer hold. I think we also need to understand, coming to the issue of, look, if we go into a reform like this, we have to understand, what does the budget actually look like? What does the system look like? And the point that was made earlier about the capacity of the state. I know everybody hates pie charts, and I hate them too, but yeah, this was the quickest way to do this. We spend most of our budget on the social sector, on social services in South Africa, and more as a percentage of GDP than most emerging market countries. In that regard, within these spending items are some things that people have spoken about today. For instance, on expanded public works programs, we spend tens of billions, including a 94 billion rand spending over the next 3 years on employment creation programs in the budget. There is a strong view that these have not been anywhere near as effective as it originally hoped. I've already indicated 56% of the budget is spent on social services like the social grants, education and health. In the case of education and health, there's two ways of looking at it. The one way of looking at it is that we spend more than our peers. Another way of looking at it that some people like to refer to is the fact that we've set ourselves certain norms in the law that obligate us to spend a certain amount, and therefore the argument on austerity, which I'll come back to in a minute. 32% of the budget is on urban development, infrastructure, and other economic services. In other words, there's a huge amount of the budget that is being spent, and these are 2019 numbers, by the way, that was spent on infrastructure and other forms of capital investment, including capital transfers to households, as well as in economic services like agriculture. That's 32%. Now, the question is, all this money is there. How well is it being spent? Well, in a number of cases, not very well. And we're certainly not getting the bang for the buck, as it were. Hence, the impetus to introduce ideas around zero-based budgeting. And while zero-based budgeting in its pure form is unlikely to be possible, in fact, it won't be possible, escaping the tyranny of incrementalism. And in my opinion, that's the only reason why people use the word austerity. It's because they're trapped in a style of reasoning that says that line items in the budget must grow by some notional metric like CPI in order to say that there's money in the system. I guess, I have a different view. I think when you think about what's happening with the money that's already there, and B, when you think about the levels of waste and maladministration that we have, you do think about it a little bit differently. We've been running a primary fiscal deficit. We will be running a primary fiscal deficit 15 years by the time we are able to achieve a primary surplus, a very small primary surplus in 2024-25. So we consider that South Africa's fiscal position has been expansionary for a long time. It's been growing faster than the economy for a long time. We're trapped in the tyranny of incrementalism, the expectation that you must always add money to items regardless of how they're performing. And I think that is a problem. And finally, we've seen this incredible increase in contingent liabilities and a dramatic weakening of the state balance sheet, which has correlated with poor skills, bad management, particularly at state-owned companies, a very dubious political economy, disincentives to make difficult political decisions, and a propensity to interfere from the political perspective, which, with the example of Eskom is one, which prevents a business from being run like a business. And so, and what this has done is it's put us in a position where we have also seen this weakening of the balance sheet. I've already spoken to this, so I'm not going to go into it. But we've said this many times that the deficit has become structural. Government has been living beyond its means for a very long time. So the question then becomes, okay, what do we do with the gray line, which is the revenue line, with respect to taxes? People have spoken a lot about that here. I'm not going to spend as much time on it, except to say that the way we see the problem is a problem of base expansion rather than rate increases. If the kind of reforms that are being discussed with respect to universal basic income require some significant reform sequencing. You need growth. You really need to look at your labor market and employment creation, because your economic growth needs to be job rich. Otherwise, it's not clear to me how in the long term you're going to solve the problem. Thirdly, you need to deal with the capacity of the state, which is not strong by any means. And fourthly, you need to say to yourself, okay, well, are we actually going to be able to sustain within the context of that social compact, that level of spending over the long term with a tax base of 6 million taxpayers? I don't think you'll be able to do it with a tax base of 8 million taxpayers. I think you need a lot more. So how do you expand the base, in addition to the fact that you need economic growth and you need it to be job rich? You can't get away from these things, it seems to me, because we've made this mistake before. We made it in 2007. The biggest fiscal policy mistake that I think we made over the last 2 decades is we responded to a temporary increase in revenue because of a terms of trade benefit by increasing spending, by increasing those permanent areas of spending, and that's what's biting us over the last while. So I think, especially when you consider the fact that South Africa is not actually, in percentage terms, is not actually a low tax country. By emerging market standards, a tax rate, a tax collection of 26% of GDP is not low by any means. And our attempts to increase tax rates on the wealthiest individuals have not been very successful. Of course, there's more to be done on wealth taxes, and we agree with that, but we do have to be careful. The other issue is tax morality, where there is a very real risk that tax morality is a problem even now, and it's becoming a bigger problem because of this issue of what's happening in the state and the capacity and the poor administration and management, and a kind of weird political economy. But it'll become worse, in my view, if we adopt a policy that says we are going to just increase the tax burden without solving the fundamental macro and microeconomic problems that we have. Yeah, I don't want to repeat the story that I've already made, which is to say that we're deeply concerned about the implications of a fiscal crisis if we return government spending, talking now about the complaints about austerity, if we return government spending to the levels, the trajectory that it was on at the level of the February 2020 budget, without changing anything else permanently, we will have a full-blown fiscal crisis, and its impact is not going to just be fiscal. It'll have a profound impact on the overall economy. Trillions will be extracted from GDP over the decade under such a scenario. As I close, my last remark on the issue of monetary policy. As I said earlier, I do think that, and I appreciate the motivation behind the views, but I do think that we have to be very, very careful, and we have to understand that we have a real risk as a country of debasing the currency. And such a scenario would put us on a path to ruin much faster than I think anything else, because we've seen it happen in many countries around the world, or numerous countries around the world, where we borrow, most of our borrowing is in local currency. And that could change very, very quickly if we're not in a position to pay back our lenders, especially since the largest portion of those lenders are foreign lenders in a currency that has a strong value. And so we have to think very carefully about that and what that would mean, not just for the Reserve Bank, but what that would mean for interest rates in the economy. So let me stop there. I think I've said my bit, so thank you.
Thanks, Edgar, and pardon me while I again slit my wrists in depression. Right, but we'll debate some of these issues. Thank you very much for the very, again, like everybody else, thoughtful contribution. Mamakele, you are the last speaker, hopefully bringing up a slightly different perspective, and all yours.
Good morning, and thanks for the invite. And it's been really interesting listening to everybody's contributions. I know, Judge Davis wants me to have a different perspective. I'm afraid.
No, I'm not suggesting you do. You do come from the private sector. You do come from the private sector, which
I can't
mean anything. Okay, sorry.
No, it's perfectly fine.
I'm sorry, Mama Kete, carry on.
But I think this is an ongoing debate that we've had for the better part of 18 months. So we were all talking a lot about what to do about poverty pre-COVID. And as we went into the crisis and things became a lot worse, I think the sort of discussion intensified. But I don't think we've moved very much, in definitely not in the past 18 months in terms of the things that are on the table and the options. So I will talk again about things I've already said, and I'll say them again. I'll keep saying them until the facts change. But I'd like to make a few points just to start. I'd like to start on the contribution that Edgar made, because it's one of the things I had on my list of comments. The whole idea that poverty can be alleviated by fiscal transfers. And we've spoken a lot about this. We spoke about poverty alleviation, and we always come back to this idea of fiscal transfers of one form or another. And my question is, one, do we have poverty because we haven't had fiscal transfers? And if that's not the answer is no, then we need to look at where the source of the problem is. So I agree with Edgar that it's a very narrow way of looking at it, and the poverty problem in South Africa is definitely not because of fiscal issues. I think you probably have to look much harder at unemployment and employment and labor market participation and labor market policy. And other areas like that. But fiscal transfers can be used as a way to alleviate the problem temporarily, but it's not a permanent solution to the poverty problems that we have in the country. So I would say, for me, it's very important that we deal with the issue at source, so to speak, and we're not doing that with the current discussion. So I suppose that'll be my starting point. And then the next one, which is I'm going to deal with things that I'm a lot less, what's the word I'm looking for? That I'm a lot less of an expert on, so to speak. But the other issue for me is the whole tax issue. So, we speak about taxes and we go line by line by line by line. But on a macro level, most of the taxes that have been put forward are all personal income taxes, so to speak. That's where you're thinking you're going to get the bulk of the funding for say a big or another type of fiscal transfer. And again, the point that Edgar makes is very important, that we are a very highly taxed society. So if you look at South African tax burden as a percentage of GDP, and if you look at PIT specifically, personal income tax, it's actually very, very high relative to other emerging markets. And actually it flags as quite high even when you compare it to, developed economies. So, the question then becomes, what are taxpayers getting for the tax they pay? A lot of jurisdictions that have got very, very high tax rates also have very high social wages, and they have very high and good quality education, healthcare, etc., which is definitely not something that we can claim. So, in South Africa, you've got very high personal income tax, levied mostly on professionals, high-earning professionals, but still professionals, with them still having to procure services in the private sector. That means your actual tax burden, if you look at it, is actually even higher than it looks like when you just look at the numbers in an obvious way. And I think these are things that we need to think about before we levy further taxes on South African workers, to say, can you really push it? And I mean, Edgar made the point about tax morality declining, we've got immigration, etc. These are all things that we need to think about. So, you don't have an endless amount of tax that you can levy. So, moving on to, another point, that I think we need to talk about, even though I'm not going to necessarily go into a lot of discussion around that. It's around this idea that, you can have quantitative easing, and that, the SARB can buy huge amounts or unlimited amounts of government debt, and this can be some sort of way of funding, government expenditure. And, my answer to this is, this is another thing that's come up. And the answer really there is simple. I'm not going to say I think. This is something that I'm pretty sure, actually, I'm quite sure would happen. If the SARB went out tomorrow and started buying the government bonds in the size that is necessary to make a difference in government funding, you would lose confidence, or investor confidence in the SARB, in the rand, etc. And you would actually precipitate an exit of offshore funders in the bond market. And it would be inflationary, it would increase your cost of funding, it would create all sorts of negative implications for the economy, for the bond market, for government funding, for the SARB itself, that I suspect in the space of less than a year, this economy would be in a recession. So it's not an option that's available for this economy, for policymakers in any way, shape, or form. I know there's a lot of people that talk about, policy has got to be a little bit more experimental, and policymaking is experimental in nature, but certain things have got fairly predictable consequences. And it would be stupid, to say the very least, to try and pursue, public policy measures that we know will lead to failure. So I'd like to just park that one and say, can we not discuss it anymore? We've discussed it for the better part of 18 months. It's not going to work. It's just a fact. So now, going back to the broader question around what are the the constraints or the possibilities around funding government expenditure and social transfers via the bond market. That's the one I'll look at specifically, because that's the one area that I know a fair degree about. So one of the things that came up, one of the issues that came up in earlier discussion is that you need to look at debt instead of looking at the overall debt stock of government when you're thinking about the constraint. You really need to look closer at the debt service cost as a percentage of expenditure. And this is definitely something that I agree with. But one of the points that also came up is that you're sitting with debt service cost to GDP that are definitely above 20%, that are trending more towards the 25%. So to say that your level of debt is not yet a problem, I think is already wrong. You're already sitting in a very precarious position where your debt stock and your debt service levels are already pushing the boundaries of what is sustainable. And in fact, if you look at where markets are at the moment, Edgar showed made the point that your debt service costs are currently higher than they've ever been. You're sitting with a very steep yield curve, and Treasury has tried by all means to try and flatten the curve. It's not working. And it's telling you that your term premium, which is the risk that is priced into your bond curve, is already quite high. I estimate that it's in the region of 200 basis points. So essentially, you're already sitting with a distressed market, and you can either take it to heart and say the market is already distressed or not, but it doesn't change the fact. So in the context of our current situation, what would happen if you pushed expenditure further? You definitely pushed expenditure beyond the point at which markets believe you can. So there's two ways in which this thing can play out. The worst way, which I think is a low probability kind of event, is that you lose market access. Or essentially, external investors sell their bonds in a hurry. You have a quick exit out of the bond market and out of financial markets and out of rand. And you have essentially in that environment an inflationary problem, which necessitates that monetary policy be tightened. And you have stagflation, which is bad for everybody. And essentially poverty will be worsened. So this is now the worst case scenario. I don't think that is likely to happen. What you might have is a continuation and a worsening of the current situation. So what is the current situation? You have very high borrowing costs, and they're already endemic, and then you make it even worse. So if you think that every single interest rate in the economy is priced off the government curve, at the short end of the curve, you've got the SARB rate, and at the back end, you've got the bond curve, and every single funder is subject to the same costs. Then a higher cost of borrowing for government means a higher cost of borrowing for everybody. And within that kind of context, you have a negative impact on investment, you have a negative impact on long-term growth, etc. Just to give you an example, one of the transactions that are currently going through the market or are currently being priced is around the IPPs. And the IPPs are normally funded of the government inflation-linked or real curve. And one of the things that came back was that it's so expensive for these transactions to be funded at the moment, more expensive than it was in previous rounds. And that they now have to think about ways in which you can alleviate that funding. What you can do in that instance is probably pass the cost on to the consumer, but it ultimately means that the cost structure for the whole economy is higher. It constrains the expansion of the private sector, and as a consequence, it almost puts you on track to having lower growth for longer. So, and I think that's a really important channel of transfer. And if you think that in South Africa, the way to address poverty in the long term is to grow the private sector, is to grow your economy. The private sector remains the bigger contributor to employment and should be the bigger contributor to employment growth going forward. So if you constrain private sector growth, you are ultimately, basically not dealing with poverty in the medium to longer term. So for me, I think you've got to look elsewhere when you think about poverty alleviation. There's a lot to be said about improving the social wage. There is a lot to be said about also not taking away from other government programs that are growth enhancing over time, be they education or healthcare. The point made about some of the resource allocation that you're now using is stuff that should be going to NHI, which should arguably be more enhancing for growth going forward. These are all points that I think are very important and need to be brought into the question. So for me, I think you already hit the limit as far as using, using the bond market to fund extra government expenditure is concerned. I'll stop there. I think there's a lot that I've said.
Thank you very much, Mamakete. It looks to me as if we've got roughly about 40 minutes for a conversation. And I'm going to start with you, Gilad, because you were the first up. It does seem to me, listening to the rest of your panelists, that the general view, and we'll get back to questions of the multiplier, which I want to raise, but just generally, it does appear to me that the rest of the panelists do not share your view that the kind of increase of taxes that you're advocating is the panacea to the problem. And I'd just like a response. I should also add that I, just from a personal point of view, I have serious doubts about whether some of those figures of yours are accurate at all. So just to give you an example, on the retirement funding issue, you've obviously taken into account RAF, pension, provident, employers' contributions, and employees, right across the board. And I'd be curious, so that's how you get your figure. But that then does mean that for all sorts of contributions in the middle ranking, below, way below $1 million, people, employers and employees would be denied that if you met your figures. But that's a secondary consideration. The fundamental one seems to me, which is not an issue I want to put my own view on, but just want to ask you. Everybody else seems to suggest that that's not the panacea.
Excellent, thanks, Dennis. There's a series of very specific issues and then a series of sort of more general issues.
But if you could deal with the general proposition first, and then we'll get to the, yeah.
Okay. There's no one panacea. Okay, I don't think anyone is suggesting that, nor would I necessarily argue that every tax option, as we have called them, should or could be introduced at the same time. Okay, the question is whether the current tax structure allows for various increases, which I think the answer is yes. I mean, in a numbers term, that's been illustrated, and we're happy. In the upcoming paper, there is details on every method, each of those tax tables used, how it's calculated, and so on. And the type of scrutiny from Ingrid and others, I think, is incredibly useful. Okay. The second question then is, should we do that? Okay, and that then entails both economic and ethical arguments around the impact and around the notion of increasing taxation on the wealthiest. But I think this brings to light broader questions, as you've raised, about the role which fiscal and macro policy plays in general. Firstly, I think the austerity denialism, which we see from Treasury, is neither helpful nor accurate. We don't choose to use these terms in certain ways. They have internationally accepted meanings. We also speak both of the impact of cutting expenditure and the impact of increasing it, which are two different things. And the impact of the proposed cuts will undoubtedly be contractionary on the economy. The second is that I would appeal that we avoid straw men and misinformation here. No one is arguing that fiscal policy is the only intervention. No one is arguing that either monetary policy or tax can be increased indefinitely. No one is arguing that this is unlimited. Also, let's avoid simplifications, which are just nonsense, like there is 6 million taxpayers. Everyone pays VAT, and a large number are employed in entities which pay corporate income tax. The third broad issue is on monetary policy. And here, unfortunately, unlike the last speaker, I prefer to deal
I'll get there. I'll get to monetary policy. I'm going to give you another chance. I just wanted to ask the other panelists in relation to the tax, and we'll get back to monetary policy in a moment. So let me go, Professor du Plessis, you raised this issue, because otherwise, if we start muddling up, the fiscal and monetary, we'll get nowhere in terms of a coherent discussion. You've raised this issue about considering the tax multiplier, which in South African case is negative. I wonder if you could expand on that so I could get some comment from everybody in the light, particularly of what Dr. Isaacs has just said.
Correct. Dennis, it's not a surprise that the tax multiplier is negative. It is expected to be negative.
I know that too, but
what is a bit discouraging in our literature and is that the estimates that we have as an empirical matter is that the tax multipliers are larger negative than the expenditure multipliers are positive. And that makes no big point. It makes the simple point that we've made from a number of different perspectives this morning, and that is what happens when you have an already developed tax structure in the economy. In other words, there's not much low-hanging fruit. And if you think of expanding the tax base through higher marginal tax rates in South Africa, you have to factor in the realistic possibility that you will harm the long-run growth rate of the economy. That's the simple point on the negative tax multipliers. And then we can have a discussion about the positive expenditure multipliers. There's a much larger literature in South Africa on that, recently summarized very usefully in a working paper published by the Reserve Bank. But their estimates, and as well as the estimates that they summarize, and as well as recent work by Harry Kemp, using a range of different methodologies, tell us that even though these estimates disagree amongst each other, there is very little that's encouraging in the range of estimates. They are almost all of them below 1. And in the most recent estimate published by the Reserve Bank that takes the evolution over time into account, it's not just that they are small, it's that they are declining. And I'll make a final comment on that. That, by the way, tells you that contraction on government's budget, though expected to be adverse for aggregate expenditure in the economy, will not be as adverse as it would have been if those expenditure multipliers were large. So it cuts both ways. Thank you.
Could I just put this to you? I heard Andrew Donaldson in a seminar that I was at recently. Edgar may have well been there as well, and maybe some of the others too, argue that in fact we've got the multiplier effect wrong. That is, it's larger. The expenditure multiplier is larger than in fact some of you economists are suggesting, which would therefore increase that if he's right, and he's raised this particularly because of the unexpected increases in growth over the last number of months coming out of COVID, that he's suggesting that actually shows some support for a larger multiplier than expected. That would support Dr. Isaacs's proposition, would it not?
It would, if the multiplier is larger.
How can we be sure? So how can we be sure that you're right? This is crucial.
It is an important point. The identification problem is large. To try to attribute the bounce back of our economy in recent quarters largely to one factor, and that factor be the stance of fiscal policy. It's not that it is impossible. It is as a logical argument. What is impossible is to solve that identification problem. And I can put an equally plausible alternative story on the table. What we had last year was not just a demand shock on the economy. In fact, what the lockdown did was in the first instance to hit the supply side of the economy in a completely unprecedented manner. And it is the return of the supply relations in the economy that can attribute to much of the bounce back that we saw. So I don't think it is easy to say I'm going to find my bounce back largely as a demand bounce back when much of the decline was caused by the supply side.
Could I just ask you, are you therefore suggesting that, in fact, the argument that the multiplier may be expenditure multiplier may be higher than we think is because actually we have this oddity of the supply constraint given COVID, and that we shouldn't be taking, and that COVID has kind of muddles up what might be called a long-term extrapolation? Is that what you...
That is exactly what I'm saying. The identification problem last year, given the highly peculiar situation, makes it very hard to generalize anything from the data from last year. And I would much rather look at the evidence we have over a longer horizon. And we've had this fiscal stance for a much longer period. And you would have to ask yourself, if the fiscal multiplier was indeed structurally so large in South Africa, why was it not large in 2017 or 2018 or 2015? And so I think we are talking about a peculiar 2019 effect there, and that's 2019 and 2020 effect, and that's really what Andrew's observing. But it's very hard to settle this case empirically.
Okay, I'll give Dr. Isaacs an opportunity later, I promise on that, but I just wanted to ask, Ingrid, the one thing that you didn't seem to, you took issue with a whole lot of issues with regard to Gilad's calculations, and I could understand all of them. I didn't quite understand, however, or take you to deal particularly with what is a significant item in his calculations on tax, which is the social security tax. And I just wondered whether, I was curious your response to that, because it's a fairly significant item in his balance sheet, if I could put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, so what I did say was that I don't think one should call it a social security tax, right? I think it's just another increase in personal income tax. And so I think one should be a little more transparent about that. Maybe it's called a social security tax because you want to earmark it. I think that's fine. I didn't take great issue with that at all. I thought, another tax of between 1.5% and 3%. Absolutely. I think there is a little bit of room to increase personal income tax rates. But
where would that be? Could I just ask you, where would that be on your calculations? I mean, I know you made a lot about this idea about 999,999 and $1 million. Yeah. I understand that, but where would you put that? You surely wouldn't be.
I would put it across the board as Gilad does. I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think
that's not going to be you're not going to be very popular with people earning 300,000-400,000 rands a year. You're not exactly doing very well.
Well, so in the new version that Gilad presented this morning, it's a progressive scheme, right?
Okay, all right. So you're not against that.
No. Can I say one last thing that I didn't say about retirement funds, because
please.
Something in the chat. So I have this great difficulty, as Dennis says, with the discontinuity at $1 million for the retirement fund contributions. But actually, my much bigger difficulty is with the public sector. So I don't think we should ever let public sector officials off the hook when it comes to new tax proposals. And currently, because government officials belong to a defined benefit scheme, right, they're not contributing. So they have these very generous pensions that don't count as part of their salary, that aren't typically spoken about as part of the salary package. So how would you bring them into the net, Gilad? I'm interested in that point. So and of course this would be a massive disincentive for people in the private sector to continue contributing as they do to retirement funds. So I'm worried about a very adverse behavioral effect of simply taking away what's currently I agree, currently a very generous regime for the deduction of retirement contributions, but with the particular purpose of wanting people to save properly for their retirements. And so I worry about a very adverse impact there.
So could I just ask you on that point, because I'm now stretching back to recesses of my memory when I was on the Tax Commission, and there was a lot of debate about, retirement funding deductions.
And of course, you introduced a retirement tax, yes.
Yeah, but the big argument at the time was if you took it all away, given a country which doesn't have much saving, this would make it even worse. Interested in whether that was right or whether, in fact, we need to qualify that proposition.
Contractual savings in the form of retirement annuity contributions are the major form of personal saving. So if you take away this massive tax benefit that is currently in place, you will automatically reduce retirement contributions. That goes without saying. And that will inevitably result in something of a private savings shortfall.
Okay. Yeah. So let me get, Edgar, it seems to me that one of the things that, and I see this in the chat line, the proposition being, if I can bring this up, because it was a question I was going to ask you, but it's been raised rather more eloquently by my friend Neil Coleman, I think, was that if you don't sort of, as it were, address the kind of fiscal problems that Gilad was talking about, you in fact then almost reproduce an even more, a less competent state, if it's possible, than the one we got at the moment. That actually then it becomes a catch-22.
Well, I guess there's an element of a kind of a counterfactual to the way, because now it's like, what if you had done the opposite? What if you had continued spending more? I guess that's the question. Should you not just continue spending more money on the back of a weak fiscus, continue lifting the rate of spending on compensation, for instance? I don't know. Look, well, I do know, actually. Let me not say I don't know. I do know. For me, the answer is no. We have a fundamental problem that I don't think is related to money, because first of all, let's take compensation. We spend more on compensation as a percentage of GDP than the average of OECD countries around the world. Our government employees, in addition to what Professor Woolard is saying about their generous pensions, are very well compensated, quite frankly, and they've become a protected class, both in terms of their wages and their jobs. Now, in respect of their wages, I think for the most part that's fine. I think it's good for public sector wage servants, public servants such as nurses and doctors, to have their salaries guaranteed. I don't have a problem with that, but I do think that to me it's not a convincing argument to say that a country that compensates its public servants more than most countries around the world is having a problem with state capacity because of compensation. I think there are other problems that we have in the system. I think that some of it is political, but look, I mean, there is an issue also around how the state does recruitment and so forth. But I don't know, I don't see it in the numbers. I think if you have had the level of increase in their salaries that you've seen, it's not the case. I don't agree. I come back to what I said earlier, and this is the last point I'm going to make. I still don't agree with this style of reasoning that says that we are hollowing out, or we are, it's like we are butchering, we're taking things away from people. What's happening is that we have had a level of spending and a level of increase in spending for more than a decade that has been unsustainable. We knew it was unsustainable before the current crisis, because if you look at the budget review in 2020, February, before there was a COVID outbreak or whatever, that was already the case, that we can't sustain that level of spending. So public servants have been receiving big increases for a number of years, above inflation every year for a decade and a half. They're amongst the most well-paid in emerging market countries in the world. The counterfactual that says, well, pay them even more, and that's how you are going to get state capacity, seems to me not to hold water. I think there are other things in the system that are a problem. Thanks.
Let me put this to you before I ask Mamokete a similar question. It's this, that it does seem to me that COVID-19 has essentially created what might be called an inflection point, particularly within economics. I'm struck by the amount of webinars I've been to, the whole group under Samuel Bowles, who've been rethinking economics in the light of COVID. And the argument is this, that countries now need to sort of think out of the box in order to lift themselves out of the COVID-19 pandemic, which means that the criticism, therefore, is that when one listens to the budget speech and the budget presentation in 2021, this is old-style economics, pre-COVID at best, and has not, in fact, shown the kind of requisite imagination, which may well require greater expenditure along the lines that Dr. Isaacs has suggested, precisely because we're in this unique situation. And we haven't done enough.
Yeah. So that is a good discussion point. And actually, we have sought to address that exact argument, particularly in our parliamentary briefings. Gillard Isaacs has been part of briefings where I have responded in this regard. And part of it goes to what Professor du Plessis was saying earlier. First of all, let's understand where we are. Fiscal space is in many ways about the starting point, right? We looked at the numbers, we've compared ourselves to our peers internationally. Our debt burden is higher than our peers, considerably higher than our peers. At the time that we were tabling the budget in February, if you look at the fiscal monitor, average emerging market debt levels of around 60% of GDP were 20% higher than that. As we've already said, we're paying R1 out of every R5 in debt service costs. That's going to rise to over 5% of GDP by 2023-24. There's no way that you're going to be able to sustain that. So we're taking a long-term view of fiscal policy rather than a short-term view. I wish that our fiscal position was better when we entered this crisis than
everybody does, but we've got to deal with what we've got.
I know, but what I'm saying is, I wish that our fiscal position was better, but it wasn't. It wasn't. The fact is that the fiscus had not been managed properly, and the fact is that our growth had been so poor. We are in our 7th year. Sorry, last year was the 7th year of negative per capita GDP in this country. So you can't walk a bad road and then expect to be in a position to do wonderful things when the need arises. The point is that if we allow ourselves, take a look at the alternative. If we allow ourselves to be in a position where we get into a fiscal crisis by the middle of the decade, everything that we're discussing here, all of the wonderful things that we say that fiscal policy can do will mean nothing. None of them will be possible anyway. You cannot get away from the need to respond to help.
Let me put the country proposition to you. I don't want to debate any with you, it's unfair, but I just want to put this final point to you before asking Kete, not a similar question. I mean, it's not just, and I don't mean just, because obviously Dr. Isaacs produces incredibly important work, but there are others who, in a sense, worked within Treasury, such as Michael Sachs, who I listened to not the other day, who said, basically his line was, show me any situation whereby the levels of kind of trying to dampen down, as we're doing at the moment, has ever worked as well. His argument is that what we're trying to do at the moment is absolutely going to get you into a bigger spiral. You've got to be able to take a deep breath and essentially do exactly the opposite of what you're suggesting.
Yeah, but Michael's view...
You were there when he said that on the last seminar. Yeah. So
Yeah,
you know what I'm talking about. Yeah.
He tells me on the phone that also as well.
I know he does tell you, it tells me too. So I'm tell everybody now.
Michael also believes, of course, that at some level a fiscal crisis is inevitable, and that there's no point trying to avoid what Mokete was describing. And of course, we are trying to avoid that. he thinks that you must just let it happen and then kind of get into a debt restructuring conversation. Where he is wrong is that he still assumes that that problem can be solved by having a debt restructuring discussion only with domestic lenders. I think he underestimates the role that foreign lenders are playing in financing the deficit. I also think, as I said at the beginning, the risks that we as a country could essentially harm the currency and debase the currency, in my view, are being underestimated, including by Michael. That's what we're trying to avoid. Thanks.
All right, I understand that. Mama Ketty, what I was interested in your presentation was you kind of spoke at great length about, obviously, the potential fiscal crisis, and I understand that perfectly. And indeed, I do know that there's a lot of work being done at the moment to understand as to whether we're not going to go the way of Argentina, with essentially a collapse almost of our financial system for the next 3 to 5 years if we carry on in this way. But that then raises the question that you sort of were quite silent about the kind of, at least this, some form of fiscal stimulus a la Dr. Isaacs's proposals, at least to essentially turbocharge us out of the difficulty in which we're at the present. And I'd be interested as to what your response to that is.
I really, Dennis, wish I could say that was possible, because it would make our life so much easier, right? It would be infinitely desirable. Obviously it's something that everybody would want. I think, that there's a lot that's been spoken about, even in the current context around, the market's tolerance maybe for more policy, what's the word I'm looking for? More policy experimentation, possibly, being a factor. I think, I really think, to Edgar's point, that, the fiscal situation that we went into the crisis with was such that was already so hamstrung and so constrained that, it's constrained our ability to do anything. And it constrains our ability to take risks as well, because it means that, your degrees of freedom are dramatically worse. So if you look at other emerging markets, for instance, some countries went to a lot of trouble to buy bonds, and they actually did see their central banks buying quite a bit of their debt. But it was with our understanding that this was once off, and secondly, that those economies can grow themselves out of that situation. I think with South Africa, you almost have the problem that you want to grow and you want to spend to grow, but you can't spend to grow because, well, you don't have any space. But you actually now are stuck in the situation where the two things are allowing you absolutely no space, I think. And I think we need to acknowledge that. We need to acknowledge that if we are going to be highly experimental, if we are going to do things that are bold and great and wonderful, the space to do it does not exist within fiscal policy. So we need to look outside of fiscal policy and look at other places. So whatever it is that we're going to try and do, we could try and liberalize labor markets, but hey, we're not talking about that. That'd be experimental relative to what we've been doing for the past 30 years. But we're not talking about that. Why are we not talking about those other types of policy where we can be a lot more aggressive? And probably what it also does, and this is the complexity of the thing, is that when you do something on one place, it allows you more degrees of freedom on another. So for instance, if you did see labor market liberalization, you could probably borrow more money, so you could spend more. And it almost like the two will reinforce each other. So, to look at fiscal policy alone without looking at all the other parts of the policy basket, it's not going to get you very far. So if we're only going to say tomorrow we're going to spend this much more on XYZ, and that's the only thing that we're going to do, we will crash ourselves. But if you do a set, you're likely to get further.
So let me ask you this bluntly, because when Professor May started, he said they were inquiring into three things: what to do, how to pay, and can the state be capable, and we're dealing with the second one. But I suppose the real question that I want to put to you is, we all accept that we are in a serious crisis of poverty. It is unbelievable. I mean, we have a 43% on an expanded definition of official unemployment. We have millions of people living on the margins, in fact, below the margins. What would you do now? You've got to do something now, and you've got to fund that somewhere.
Yeah, so, you know,
I mean, we're not doing enough. We must accept.
No. Yeah.
So the question is, what do we, Dr. Isaacs has put up proposals. I understand she has as well. I'm interested, if I appointed you as Minister of Finance tomorrow morning, which wouldn't be a bad idea, by the way, but if I did, what would you, not that I've got any power, but what would you
You know, I think it is beyond the purview of the Ministry of Finance. I think this sits within the presidency. Because
okay, all right, okay.
Policy.
You talking to the president, what would you do?
Yeah, so I would say to him, you need to buy yourself space somewhere else to allow you to borrow more. So, for instance, if I look at, for instance, like accelerating, the delivery of electricity. It seems like an unrelated policy, but it actually is not. Because if you say you liberalize the policy space within electricity, and we all think, in a year's time, we will have sufficient electricity, et cetera, suddenly your growth outlook improves. You can actually spend more, because what it'll do is it'll lower your cost of funding. It'll make investors much more tolerant of higher fiscal deficits, probably. And it means that you pull one lever and it allows you scope on another lever. And I think when we speak about policy and we focus only on finance, we lose the actual where the levers for policy actually sit. And the levers to borrow more do not sit within Treasury. They sit in other departments outside of Treasury.
Okay. Gillard, I know we're running out of time, and I wanted to give you an opportunity briefly to respond to what are different perspectives of your panelists, to your proposals, and then you're very free, if you could do that very briefly, and then I know you wanted to engage with, particularly with Professor Du Plessis on the monetary side. So please carry on.
Thanks, Dennis. I'd like to build up towards the end point, if that's all right.
Briefly, because we don't have a lot of time.
Okay, so I'm going to join those two issues then. The first is just to ask on process that we have a conversation in which people take seriously what the other people actually say. And to hear Edgar, for instance, answer a question of state capacity, which ends with the implication that there's someone saying that our wage bill should just increase inevitably, is hard to have these conversations when there's an establishment of these straw men, in which case.
Sorry, what is a straw? I don't understand. What is a straw man?
There's been a ongoing distortion of the fact that anyone here is arguing that fiscal policy can do everything by itself. Okay. And ongoing.
I didn't take him to be saying that. I'm much more
distortion that there's this inevitable increase in expenditure. So I would just appreciate if we try to have these conversations without those and take seriously.
Thank you. All right, let's move on.
What everyone's saying. Okay. I think that the point of fiscal multipliers is really important because, and there's two things there. The first is that tax and expenditure multipliers have to be viewed in sync. We increase the taxation in order to spend, and we do that in targeted ways on both ends, right? And some spending is going to have a bad outcome. Some spending will have
But do you have figures which suggest? Do you have figures which suggest that in fact it's wrong, that the multiplier is actually larger, the kind of Donaldson argument in general terms, which essentially would therefore support your proposition?
Absolutely, because the multiplier is a policy variable. It's not an unchanging number, and
I understand
international
that, but the
evidence
evidence
is clear.
I understand that.
Right.
Sorry to interrupt you, but the evidence suggests, other than what Andrew is telling me, almost every other economist I've read and spoken to look at the studies suggest a much more modest multiplier, which has consequences, therefore, for the kind of expenditure that we're talking about over and above the amounts that we collect in tax. That's what I put.
And almost all of that research works at the aggregate level. And the point is that one needs to understand which taxation and which expenditure here,
Okay.
right? And if we can do that, then we can have a sort of targeted conversation about those things.
So what expenditure would you advocate?
Well, this is about the role of fiscal policy, which we keep hearing is ineffective, right? And the point is that we need a understanding of macro policy, which says that macro policy has a role to play in supporting the kind of industrial restructuring which all of us agree on, right? Whether that's expansion of renewables, whether that's increased transport networks, whether that's improved electricity, that there is no doubt that certain forms of fiscal policy both expand demand in the economy and have a positive impact on the supply side, right? And the question here is about the role of macro policy in a transformative agenda. It's not about, and that means that we look, right?
Well, that's a war cry. What does that mean in practice?
In practice, what it means is an identification of the type of structural transformation which the economy needs, right? Which is an expansion, as Treasury said, in various network industries, but is a supportive expenditure of manufacturing. So that means increased rail, which supports manufacturing industries and so on, right?
Okay, gotcha.
A fiscal expenditure that is structured around the type of structural transformation, okay, whether that's about education or whether that's about physical infrastructure. And we cannot achieve that type of structural transformation of the economy if we throw up our hands and say fiscal policy isn't useful in these ways, right? What we need to understand is where it is useful, right? And that's not the sort of starting point of this conversation, which I'm hearing here. I think you're going to sort of cut me off, Dennis. So should I stop talking?
I'm not cutting you off. No. I want to ask you one final question. I'm trying to be fair to everybody, and I've only got 6 minutes to go.
Absolutely.
No. I wish I had another hour or two, because this is a fantastically interesting debate. Could I ask you just to respond to this, Gilad, because it is the monetary side. There's so many other questions, but this is the one I wanted to ask, because Mamakete and I think to some extent Edgar putting the point that we've got this extraordinary interest burden already. And Professor Duplessis showed that. In other words, I can't let this go. He's suggesting that we could have an interest cost of 7.8% of GDP on his figures. And I'd like you to respond to that, as to what your response is to that, what effect that would have. Is he right? And what should we be worried about that?
I think we should be. I've laid out 3 options, right? The idea that there's no room for QE, this graph here shows that from the IMF for other comparative emerging markets, including those with low growth rates. And South Africa sits at the second lowest of this end. The IMF itself speaks about capital management and the role that plays in managing.
But how many of those graphs of yours have interest costs, which are perhaps can get up to 7.8% of GDP?
I mean, that's fair. There's about a third of those which face significantly high interest costs. Okay. And the type of monetary policy ideas which I'm putting forward aren't about endless monetization of our expenditure, right? For instance, extremely significantly used both in Africa and elsewhere now and internationally, although more in the past, is the idea of subsidized lending, okay, which is a targeted, can focus on infrastructure or small businesses. These are not, we can claim in the abstract, as Mamaketi does, that these things will lead to an implosion of Reserve Bank credibility and so on. But I don't find those conversations to be rooted in the concrete of what these proposals are and where they have actually worked.
Let me ask you one final point before turning to Professor du Plessis. Would you accept that the kind of borrowing that you're advocating has to be a short-term solution? It cannot be more than that for the emergency in which we're in. So yes or no?
Yes, that's what counter-cyclical means, that there comes a point where you pay it back.
Okay, thank you. Professor du Plessis, I know you wanted to respond. I wanted to ask you something as well, but you carry on.
Very briefly, Dennis. These large expansions of balance sheets that we've seen around the world over the last 10 years are mostly in the context of countries where the interest rate has gone to the zero lower bound. It is in the discussion of trying to raise inflation expectations in those countries that we can talk sensibly about the use of the balance sheet of the central bank.
Could I just ask you this? Sorry, could I ask you this? I know that, for example, in the United States, Paul Krugman has been saying, well, you can borrow as much as you like, because frankly, the interest rates are almost nothing.
Yes.
Is that what you're really saying?
It is. What I'm saying is, the Krugman argument, indeed, and first made it in the context of Japan 20 years ago, is that is how you raise the inflation expectations from zero or even negative to a positive number. But we shouldn't forget that that is the purpose. The purpose of this monetary intervention is to raise inflation expectations. Now, in our case, the inflation expectations are already 4.5% and higher, and that is why doing the same in South Africa will have the predictable impact on long-term interest rates and the fiscal burden.
Okay. Edgar, finally to you, because I'm sorry, Ingrid, I was going to get back to you, but I just want to ask Edgar, do you think it is possible, along the lines that Gilad is talking about, that some short term, whilst we restructure the economy, looking at on the monetary side is not unimportant to get us out of the crisis?
Well, I think, and you may not like my answer, I think that what we actually need— I
like all answers, carry on.
I think what we actually need in government is we do need to get back to really prioritizing our spending, because part of the problem that we have at the moment is that everything is important, and therefore nothing is actually prioritized. I think that's a fundamental problem that we face at the moment. I think we did illustrate for the 2021 budget that for the right reasons, we're willing to raise the spending ceiling. People forget that we actually, we had a particular position in October when it became clear that two things may be useful. The one is the vaccine, obviously, and the second one, while there's debates about it over the long term, in the short term, that the president's employment scheme could also be useful. We raised the spending ceiling for those two things. So I guess, our view, and, the budget illustrates this, and this is sometimes overlooked. The Treasury has the desire to take a look at things that will work. That's how I would answer that question. Thanks.
Well, I want to ask you one final point, because it's up on my screen, and I think it's a fair point to ask you as Treasury, that we are in a humanitarian crisis, and that requires out-of-the-box intervention. And I think what was being suggested was, we haven't heard anything as how we're going to stop people starving.
Well, I mean, people might know this or not know this, but when we last year were talking, for example, just use an example about sort of distress, you know, the proposal that we received initially was we have 3 months of social relief of distress. It was the Treasury that said we needed 6 months of social relief of distress.
Okay.
My point, Dennis, is that the Treasury is not sitting and saying, well, you know, come what may, nothing that's good and that's important for the economy will be supported. That's not the point. The point is that whatever we do from a fiscal policy perspective, there has to be an equal match between what can be permanent from a spending side and what can be permanent from a revenue side. Alternatively, it needs to be temporary, and it needs to be within the realities of the things that we cannot control. Thanks.
Thank you. I want to apologize to both, all of you, because I had it here on a piece of paper, a whole host of further questions I was going to ask everybody, particularly Mamakete and Ingrid. I do apologize, but we are beyond the time that was allocated to me. So Professor Kirsten, back to you. Let me thank my panelists for putting up with me and answering a whole range of, I think, really important questions. We could have had another hour on this, but there we are.
Indeed, and thank you, Dennis. I'm so grateful that you agreed to moderate this, because you did exactly what I thought you would do, and we really appreciate your contribution and facilitation process. I was saying to Nadia, maybe we should send you the recording for your TV show, because I think there are so many.
I think, yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but I do think this is the kind of a program, but the kind of debate we've just had, that the country should be exposed to in far greater numbers. I agree with you entirely.
Yes.
Sorry
thank you very much for doing exactly what Judge Dennis Davis usually do. So I thank you very much. And thank you again to everybody, Edgar, for agreeing in this difficult environment, Mamakete, Gilad, thank you very much again to debate this, and Ingrid, and as well Stan for your contribution as well. I will now hand over to Julian. He wants to just say a few things about the other seminars that the Standing Committee will host, and then Himla will close by thanking all of you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Johan. You've said all of the thanks. So just a few reflections on what we've heard so far. Around the mid-1990s was the first time I paid a visit to the Bureau of Economic Research. I came to present on this poverty and inequality report that I had been working on. And I think the seminar itself was a seminar leading up towards the GEAR policy. When I left that seminar, I remarked to the early career researcher who accompanied me, I believe her name was Ingrid, how much I envied the cheeriness of macroeconomists, where macroeconomists worried about the quality of our data and the situations that we were describing. They seem to be this kind of easygoing way of describing how things would change, and if you did this, that would happen, and if you didn't, this would happen. It strikes me you're not so cheery anymore. We certainly heard a very sobering discussion about what was possible. I left thinking, well, maybe we didn't phrase this question well enough about how to pay for it. We can pay for our intervention with money. We've spoken a lot about the opportunities to get that money, whether we borrow or tax. Neither looked very promising. We can pay for things by working ourselves, somehow work our way out of the problem. We've been talking about that for a long time, and we're not really getting too far with that. And finally, we can pay for something by sacrificing. The question now is, who is going to be sacrificed, or what is going to be sacrificed? As a poverty researcher, I now work mostly with people in public health or public nutrition or local governments. To each of them, I think I would have to say, the humanitarian crisis that we are in now is going to continue. And you better brace yourself by thinking about how we're going to deliver emergency food relief. How are we going to deal with immediate problems of hunger and starvation? If I have one policy message that I will continue to thump my little tub on, it's going to be, and I've been doing this again for nearly 30 years, I think, and that's going to be investing in a child support grant for pregnant women. Because ultimately, we're talking about something that is going to take so long that we need to preserve those children that are not yet born to be able to take advantage of what we're looking forward to if we are to achieve any movement forward. The last thing I wanted to comment on, as many of you are aware, 2 weeks ago, Vishnu Padiachi died. And as I listened to this, I thought how much he would have enjoyed this debate, this bringing together and considering of issues of fiscal policy and of monetary policy. And I think when Dennis made the comment about Sam Bowles, it made me think that we really are at a point not unlike in the early 1990s when the Macroeconomic Research Group was formed, MERG, that Vishnu was leading. And maybe it's time, if we are to really think out of the box, for another MERG, where we can try and bring together economists of all kinds to be able to debate and think how we can possibly think out of the box and come up with better solutions. The last of these webinars will take place in approximately a month's time. Nadia Weitz from the ASSAf and myself are meeting with the convener of that session tomorrow. We're hoping to have a discussion about its exact format, and that webinar is going to focus on, if we have a sense of what it is that we should be doing, is the state capable of doing it? So thank you again to everyone for your for participation. That was a lively debate, and I really love the idea of trying to edit that debate into something that could appear on television. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Judge Dennis, and participants for this discussion. I mean, it was above my expertise to comprehend everything, but it was a sobering perception of bringing the different sides in the debate together. From my perspective, the way I see it is more than half of what I earn goes into taxes, but what do I really get for it? And what is it that it contributes to in this whole impact that we supposedly make to society? So it was very, very, very interesting to get the various perspectives. And again, Judge Dennis Davis interrogated our participants to expand on the various points that they made during their first preamble. It's very enriching. It's also a little bit scary when we think that we spend much, much more as a country than we actually bring together from the fiscus. So I would look with anticipation to see how the series rolls out in terms of unpacking the salient pointers that we could put together and come up with something concrete from an ASSAf perspective in terms of how we think about this whole question about poverty and inequality. Thank you all once again. It is always, always such an honor to be part of these discussions, and I wish you a good day forward. All the best. Thanks very, very much. Bye for now.